which running backs should you be buying in the second half? And the last few weeks, we've talked about a few questions like this, guys who could break out, guys who are potential sleepers. But again, I write that buy sell column every week. And when you get to this point in the year, you start to turn your focus to the stretch run and what can guys do potentially on the way to the fantasy playoffs, in the fantasy playoffs, and can they get you a fantasy championship? And I have 4 guys here that I want to talk about that I think people need to be moving heaven and earth to try to get them on their rosters. The first one, Jaylen Warren on the Steelers. And Harmon, you don't hear me talk about the Steelers very often as an offense that I want people to go out and buy. And yet Warren right now is set up so well on the season, just the RB19 in fantasy points per game. And he's maintained like a pretty steady, like 60-ish% of the snaps. So he is the clear lead back. We're not seeing Caleb Johnson really step up and take over this backfield or really get involved much at all. Exactly. Kenneth Gainwell, just like that backup. And Kenneth Gainwell, a fine stash for fantasy, a guy that when he gets into the lead back role, if there's an injury, he's shown that he can do something with it, but he's not really that involved. He's not taking this job away from Warren. So he's the lead back in an offense that faces the Chargers this week. So that one's not a great matchup necessarily, not the easiest. But then the Bengals in week 11, the Bears in week 12, the Bills in week 13, the Ravens in week 14, and the Dolphins in week 15, the first week of the fantasy playoffs. Those are all positive matchups for fantasy running backs. 4 of them are inside the top 8 for most fantasy points allowed to the position. And we just haven't seen any reason to think that there's going to be anyone taking significant touches away from Jaylen Warren. So he is a guy that I think this is setting up so nicely for him. So is Quinshon Judkins on the Browns. And this is a guy that I've talked about before. He suffered a shoulder injury before the bye that forced him to leave early in week 8, but back at practice coming off the bye, the expectations, all signs are that he's going to play this week. And he's going up against that very Jets defense we were talking about earlier that might be kind of demoralized because they just lost 2 of their best players. And this is an extremely rare occasion because the Browns are actually favored on the road here. There could be some positive game script for Judkins, and we know he's not overly involved in the passing game. So you want a contest where he's going to be able to, the team's going to keep it close or potentially be leading. This is a weird scenario where they very well might be in this one. So that's very important. And he is a guy that has been really, really solid for fantasy. RB12 in fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks before he got hurt in that week 8 contest. And his schedule the rest of the way, so tempting here. The Jets, the Ravens, the Raiders, the 49ers, the Titans, the Bears, and the Bills over his next 7 games. So 6 of those defenses are plus matchups for fantasy backs. The 7th is the 49ers, who we talked about off the top. They're still kind of searching for a new identity after all the injuries that they had. So I'm valuing Judkins as a top 15 fantasy running back the rest of the way. And I could definitely see him be an RB1. And I think he's just kind of a bit out of sight, out of mind because he's with the Browns and just, because he had the injury and is coming off a bye and all those sorts of things. So try to go out and get him. Chase Brown, I mean, we've talked about the Bengals offense and them having a little more pop with Joe Flacco. This is a team that is on bye right now. So you go take a look, see what the manager that has him is doing with their lineup. If they have replacements, if he's on the bench, this is a nice opportunity to try to go and get him. They're not going to need him this week. And he's had some better games with Flacco under center. But the key here, Samaje Perine suffered a high ankle sprain in that last game that Cincy had, and that's going to keep him out. They've already said it's going to keep him out a few weeks, so they have the bye. He'll try to get healthy, but I'm guessing he's going to miss some time after that as well. And in his absence, we saw Brown play the most that he's played all year, 96% of the snaps in the last game. That is absurd. He was down at like 50, 60% some weeks. We were seeing Perine get more involved. Not anymore. I don't think they trust anyone else in that backfield. Perine was like the veteran guy that I think they had a lot of faith in. If he's not out there, this is the Chase Brown show. He just had his 3rd straight game with over 100 scrimmage yards to talk about that recent success, the recent production. And down the stretch from week 13 on, another guy with a good schedule. Obviously, that's a common theme here for these guys I'm targeting. The Ravens, the Bills, the Ravens again, and the Dolphins. Those are all top 8 matchups for fantasy running backs. So I know it was a tough start to the season. I know Chase Brown was somebody that I was recommending throughout the summer, throughout draft season. Didn't get off to that good start for a variety of reasons. Now I think he actually might have a strong finish and help you get there. And then the last one is obvious, so we don't need to spend too much time on it, but Derrick Henry. Do you not just try to go trade for Derrick Henry at this time every year? But Lamar Jackson back healthy. The offense looking much better, obviously, and Henry just tends to be that bulldozer. When we get to late November into December, you're going to see Derrick Henry putting up big games, finding the end zone. And I'm looking at matchups that he has against that depleted Jets defense in week 12. He's got a pair of meetings, too, with the number one opponent for fantasy running backs. Gets to face the Bengals in week 13 and the Bengals in week 15, that first week of the fantasy playoffs. So the first week of the fantasy playoffs is one that you should be targeting. If your league doesn't have buys, if you have to play in that one, if you're not set up to get a buy, you want to make sure your roster is strong. You go week by week at that point. So you focus on that one. Don't get too crazy and look at week 17 and think about, well, if I make it to the fantasy championship. No. You'll deal with that when you get there. Focus on week 15. Make sure you get the win and move on. And basically all these guys on this list have good matchups to start the fantasy playoffs. And most of them have very solid matchups all along the way there as well.
I love it. That was great analysis on all those guys, and I actually think it went in order of easiest to most difficult to trade for in terms of Warren down there to Henry. And yeah, Derrick Henry too, not to mention just another variable on that. The Ravens defense is definitely looking better. You know, it's trending in the right direction now at this point. Of course, they keep beat down on the Dolphins. That's not surprising. But, you know, Kyle Hamilton moving around, being that movable chess piece, I think that really matters for this defense's outlook the rest of the way. And if that defense is better, Derrick Henry will be in those better game scripts for him to be that late season hammer. So I really love that. And yeah, no, great list. I think all those guys are really good trade candidates right now. And Chase Brown, the Samaje Perine thing cannot be overstated. They signed Samaje Perine just to be a snap eater so that they didn't have to play Chase Brown on 90% of the plays like they did last year. Well, guess what, buddy? They're back to doing that. So I think Chase Brown is locked and loaded rest of the way. But great list. All guys that I think are really good buys right now.